Hello, everyone, and welcome to Student Housing Unlocked, Multi-Housing News' podcast series that delves into investments, strategies, operations, and different approaches in the student housing sector. I'm Olivia Bunescu, Senior Associate Editor, and for this episode of our series, I'm joined by Geoff Eisenacher, Executive Development Director at Gilbane Development, to discuss how student housing is evolving at a time of shifting demographics, aging campus inventory, and sustained demand for the residential college experience. We talk about Gilbane's student housing strategy, the growing role of public-private partnerships, and how universities are using housing redevelopment to support affordability, competitiveness, and student success. The main takeaway: student housing is no longer just about adding beds, but about helping campuses solve bigger challenges through more holistic, flexible, and financially strategic projects. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to Student Housing Unlocked. Today we'll discuss a bit about Gilbane's strategy and the current state of the student housing market, as well as your point of view regarding private-public partnerships.
Terrific. I'm excited.
How would you describe the state of the student housing sector today, both from a development standpoint and from an investment standpoint?
So the student housing sector from its beginning has always been evolving. And I would kind of liken the student housing sector today to be in its kind of like fourth iteration of evolving in this space. The first was kind of like out of necessity. People were figuring it out, and then it matured into something more programmatic. And then the industry really grew into kind of a proper investment and residential vertical. And I would say where it is right now is, you have these shifting demographics and you have the longevity of on-campus student housing, off-campus student housing, and they're kind of, the worlds are kind of colliding. So you have some regions and states are trying to update and modernize their student housing to remain competitive. Others are growing and just trying to purely satisfy demand. And so state of Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Kentucky, those are kind of the stereotypical states, South Carolina, North Carolina, where these schools are not necessarily seeing a dramatic decline in enrollments. And so that is kind of causing schools to really focus on enhancing and improving their residential campus offerings. The other part of that is, some of these buildings on these campuses are circa 1960s, 1970s. So you have the dynamic that I just said, where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity and need for capital investment, either on and off campus. And their existing inventory that has been housing these students are either nearing or at the end of their useful life. And so these projects that we're seeing in the space right now, they're larger, they're more multifaceted, they're renovations, they're new, they involve other things, parking, dining, mixed use spaces. And so it's in the 90s, it was somebody went to market and said, I'm going to build a building. I need 500 beds. Now it's, I have 3,000 beds on campus and I need to rethink it all and do a multi-phase, multifaceted kind of redevelopment, renovation of my housing that involves both new and renovation. So it's exciting. And so that's kind of how I see it from a development perspective. From an investment perspective, it's still extremely robust. There's still a significant pent-up demand to invest in both off-campus purpose-built student housing as well as on-campus P3s. And speaking just to the on-campus P3s, a lot of the capital that is investing in on-campus student housing are the same funds, firms, insurance companies, life insurance companies that are buying the university's general obligation bonds. And so there is a distinct interest that if these investors are already investing in the campus and their success and their enrollments and everything that's going on, that investing in student housing is just a value add investment. The interest rate, the return is usually slightly higher. and it's just a continuation of them being bullish on whatever trajectory the campus is on. So it is a strong, very strong industry. It can get a little bit tricky based upon, where you are in the United States and what's going on at that particular campus or in that region with enrollments, but overall, it's still a very, very strong sector.
I've been working on the Outlook articles for quite some time now, and I've always noticed that student housing has been considered a more resilient asset type. What do you think are the main factors that drive that resilience?
So I think when online classes, a la the University of Phoenix and those sort of opportunities came along, people started to worry, well, if students can get an online education from their home, it's just going to continue to grow and students are just going to be virtual. And what we saw and what was really proved out during COVID was that is partly true, but the on-campus, the physical campus, and the on-campus residential experience for now does not seem to be in jeopardy. Students and the students' parents, they want to go to campus, they want to live on campus, they want to integrate, they want to live on their own. It's part of the maturation of a student. And, we see that progressing. Even during COVID, a lot of campuses and student housing off campus and even on campus were full. And they were taking classes online. So they were living in the residence halls, taking all their classes online, and still wanted to be on that physical campus. And so what we're looking at today is that is persisting, and students still want to be on campus. They still want that traditional experience, but they're taking hybrid approaches. They're taking 25 or 50% of their classes in person, and the other half they're taking online. And that's just that dynamic of being in person on campus. And for everyone who went to college and lived in a university residence hall, you kind of understand what that means during that period of your life. And it's a real focus. And I don't see that changing anytime in the near term.
And are these the reasons why student housing is attractive to you as a company, or are there any other reasons?
So we, as an integrated builder, developer, operator of student housing, both on and off campus, we have deep roots from a development side, certainly from a building side, across our 156 years of building almost 400 student housing projects on, dozens and dozens of campuses in almost all the states in the upper 48. And so it's kind of everything I said, which is we see the strength of higher education in particular areas. We see the necessity and demand for the on-campus student experience. And then we have our deep roots and deep experience in building and developing and financing and operating that. And so it's a very sound business model for us. And it's one that we think we are excelling in, and we look at it and we think we can continue to excel and we can do work that we are extraordinarily proud of. And as a family-owned company that's privately held over the last 150 years, it's a good story of helping educate and house and improve facilities on institutions of higher learning to kind of continue the evolution of the youth that are going there.
And considering the footprint of the company, which is very extensive, as I said, both on campus and off campus, and you're present in multiple university markets, how would you summarize your student housing strategy today?
So our number one strategy, and we have two, for the purpose-built student housing, there's a lot of market research that goes into understanding the enrollment shifts, where competitors are, what's in the pipeline, and not oversaturating a market. And that's just kind of a strategy that everyone in the purpose-built student housing market looks at. It's opportunistic. It's where can you find the right site adjacent to the right university with the right demand and the right enrollment trajectory, and then putting together a development model that creates the most value for everyone. I think kind of similar to that in the off-campus space is you have everything from 2-year vocational college systems throughout the United States to tier 2 and tier 3 regional public institutions to Power 4 conference tier 1 institutions. And everyone wants to go and they're attracted to schools in the SEC and we look at those as well. But we see and we focus a lot on these tier 2 regional public institutions that are anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 students, and they're in proximity to a major metropolitan urban center in a state with a good economy. And while enrollments tend to fluctuate at those schools, and you have schools in the state of Michigan, as an example, where there's the enrollment cliff and then shifting demographics in the state. But those tier 2 regional public schools, they serve a distinct need, and they may not be 25,000 students as they were back in 2010 or 2015, but they're a very steady 15 or 13,000 full-time enrollment school that still serves critical need, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And so that's just kind of how we look at it. We look at the liquidity of the school, we look at how stable their enrollments are, we look at their programs and the leadership to make sure that wherever we decide to invest our time and resources and capital, that we share similar visions about what the next steps are for the school. So, everything, whether it's on campus or off campus, is all about the underlying school's success and the trajectory of where the school is going. But it all comes down to kind of the quality of that institution or that region to determine kind of where you invest your resources.
I'd like to discuss a bit about public-private partnerships. It's a topic that I've slightly written about in some of the articles, but I have never discussed it on the podcast. And it's a topic I'm pretty interested in because here we don't have on-campus, off-campus student housing. We only have on-campus student housing, which is publicly funded. So you have entered several public-private partnerships. Why are most colleges and universities considering P3s today instead of developing, financing, or operating student housing on their own?
So you kind of highlighted the issue. In other parts of the world, Canada being very similar, higher education facilities are publicly funded. They're all publicly funded, and there's a mechanism for that. The issue in the States is since the early 2000s, state support for public schools has significantly decreased. Support for projects, annual appropriations for ongoing operating dollars, it's just consistently gone downhill. You had some schools that were 75% publicly funded, and now they're less than 20% publicly funded. And so that just has tentacles throughout the whole school. And the fundamental scorecard by which schools are gauged in their financial health and how much capital they can access is how much debt they have on their balance sheet and what their credit rating is. And so the more project that they fund themselves with their own capital, the more debt that they put on their balance sheet, and that may have a corresponding negative impact to their credit rating. And so many of these schools, virtually all of them that use a P3, are looking at saying, if I have $100 million to spend, if I have capacity to spend $100 million, do I spend that on a student housing facility that has revenues attached to it and that can be financed privately through a P3? Or should I use that to build a new classroom, a new athletic stadium, a new academic building that doesn't technically have revenues attached to it? And so that's kind of the decision making is it's a value for money analysis in this environment of limited resources from the state, from their ability to bond projects on their own. And it's a where's my money best spent? And so this, back to your first question, this need to invest in student housing and the reason why student housing P3s are getting larger and more frequent is because the need is getting greater, the age of the facility is getting older, and the need across the campus is significant in order for these schools to remain competitive and to compete. And that's across all things. That's dining, recreation, academic, parking, infrastructure, especially. And so that's kind of the reason there just isn't enough ability to publicly finance all these things. So it kind of requires these schools to think strategically about, do I use a P3?
And one of your more recent projects, the Elevate WKU partnership, is one of the largest residential investments in the university's history. What does a project of that scale tell you about where campus housing modernization is headed?
So WKU is a very similar project to the project that we just completed at Eastern Michigan, which was Welcome Home 2024. It was also similar to what we're doing out at the University of Idaho, which is Illuminate Idaho. And all of those are, again, strategic whole of campus master plans that in one way, shape, or form is a redevelopment and a renovation of all their student housing beds. And what it says is kind of what I have said before is the schools are looking at their campus housing inventory, the revenues that are attached to it, the operating expenses that are a result of aging facilities and them being highly inefficient. They're looking at, I have too many double loaded corridor traditional residence hall style beds. I don't have enough apartment style beds, which is forcing students off campus and they're taking their rental dollars off campus. And the schools are just looking across their housing as a strategy to attract, retain, graduate, and improve student success for students from the time they get on campus to the time they graduate. And that's what we're seeing. Usually, over the last 15, 20 years, you saw only a handful of these whole campus strategies. Now, I'm not saying it's everyone that comes out, but it's a large number of all the RFPs that we see are these holistic strategies that are looking across all their housing inventory. And it's for very good reason.
And when you enter a P3, how do you balance the university's mission and control over the student experience with the need to deliver a financially viable, privately developed project?
So that's the art. I think in the olden days, people would think, oh, I'm going to do a P3 and I'm going to invite a developer on campus and they're just going to tell me what product they're building and how they're going to operate it and what rents they're going to charge. And I'm just going to have to, sit over here and watch it. And I think a lot of the schools are seeing that's just not the case. And so we look at it through the lens of, we are accessing private capital and we are financing it off your balance sheet and protecting your credit. But all we're doing is we're bringing that bucket of capital back and we're sitting with you and your Department of Housing and Residence Life, with your design, with your construction folks, with the leadership, with the CFO of the school, with the president, oftentimes with the board. And we're saying, what are your goals? What is it that you're looking to achieve? What type of beds are you looking to deliver? What are we building it out of? What standards are we designing and building to? And how do you want this housing to support you in whatever your strategic mission or master plan is going forward? And that is all the work that is happening from the time we are awarded a project to when we close. And it's highly, highly collaborative. And I think a lot of the schools that have already done a P3 with us or with others, they've realized that it's a way for them to have their cake and eat it too, that it's not something to be afraid of. It actually gives them more control and more influence, because if we're doing a $200 million project, they probably would only have an ability to do a $10 or a $20 million project if we weren't involved. And so it allows them way more control and opportunity to shape this residential experience exactly the way they want it, to impact the most number of students in a P3 versus trying to do it on their own. So it kind of flips that narrative on its ear and they get more control, not less.
So, in terms of portfolio growth, specifically for Gilbane, how are you viewing the balance between on-campus fee-free opportunities and off-campus purpose-built student housing as part of your strategy?
So there are two separate verticals within the Gilbane umbrella. There's a team working on purpose-built student housing and the team that I lead that is working on the on-campus P3. So speaking selfishly, I think I don't know long-term that I can say anything definitive about the off-campus housing world because I think it's always going to be. There's always going to be purpose-built student housing projects built, and there's already a lot of purpose-built student housing projects out there, and I think some of them are 20 or 30 years old, so the new projects being built are just going to be newer. They're just going to be better. They're going to be maybe better located, better amenitized, shinier. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for those to continue to grow. But I think we really get excited when we look at the on-campus student housing world because there's 3,000 traditional public-private schools, colleges, and universities out there with beds on campus. And the majority of them aren't going anywhere anytime soon. The majority of them have a material number of beds already on their campus that are getting older. And yes, there's going to be some consolidation, and some are going to grow, some are going to shrink. But the core of that space with that number of schools is very, very meaningful. And I think unlike the off-campus housing world, you're not going to run out of land, or you're not going to have to go buy sites. These are typically campuses and land that these schools already have, and a lot of them are already looking to knock down buildings to make way for something new. That just allows the on-campus P3 world to kind of thrive and continue to evolve and support the students across a larger swath of students on a larger swath of colleges and universities across the United States. There's a couple schools, I won't name them, but in the olden days, in the 70s, schools were throwing up housing as quickly as they could. So if you go on a lot of campuses, you just see these massive towers, high-rise towers that have 1,000 beds in each one, and there's multiple. There could be 2 or 3 of these, and they're very old, they're very outdated. They have common bathrooms, only a couple of elevators. They're not very well amenitized, and so and they're inefficient. So they're leaking, their infrastructure is crumbling, and so you're seeing a lot of campuses just demolish these massive buildings and open up large development sites in the middle of a campus, and so have this opportunity to rethink what this area of their campus looks like and what the residential experience could look like. Because you don't have to build back traditional dormitory style units. You can do suite style, you can do apartment, you can do a little bit of both. And so, yes, and some of these projects get very large when you take down 1,000 beds at a time.
And that's a great intro for my next question. How do you decide whether a market needs more beds, better beds, or a different kind of housing project altogether? And if you have any recent examples that you'd like to share.
Sure. So it all comes down to performing a market and demand study. So what type of beds or how many beds or what the rental rates need to be or what the amenities are, that's not done by just us or just the school. There's a series of consultants out there that, their full-time job is to go in and assess the on-campus beds, the off-campus beds, and then do a survey of all the students at that particular campus. And they ask them a series of questions they test different unit types. So on one particular survey, they may test suite, semi-suite style beds, apartment style beds. If it's apartment style beds, they'll test studios, 1 beds, 2 beds, 4 beds. And they'll ask these students based upon some theoretical rates, some theoretical amenities, where would you like to live? And why did you choose that? Where did you live before? And so it creates an empirical data set that you can analyze, and you can tell, exactly what the mathematical calculated demand is based upon the number of beds on campus, the number of beds off campus. And so that's kind of an important ground rule, and the first thing that's done to kind of determine, all right, what is it that we're doing? We're going to let your students tell us what they want. And so oftentimes that will tell us what the upper end, what the pricing elasticity is, what the upper end, the maximum you can charge in that particular market. And it'll tell us how many suite style beds, how many apartment beds. At Eastern Michigan, as a good example, when we did that market and demand study, they had 4,000 on-campus beds, circa 1960s, 1970s. They did not have enough apartments. They only had really 300 modern student housing apartment beds. And so through the market and demand study, they realized, well, we don't need 4,000 beds, we need 3,000 beds. And of those 3,000 beds, we don't need it to be all these residence halls. We're going to take those offline. We're going to demolish those. We're going to keep about 1,500 traditional residence hall beds, but we're going to renovate those for freshmen, sophomores. And we ended up filling the gap with building them 700 new apartment beds that they didn't have. And immediately after building those 700 apartment beds were the first beds to go on campus. So it proved the theory of students didn't want to move off campus because they wanted to be closer to resources. Parents wanted them to be on campus, but they were being forced off campus because there wasn't any modern apartment beds on campus. So that's a good example. Western Kentucky, we talked about that one. Phase one is a new suite style building that is replacing a couple projects that we are taking down, but phase two eventually will be very similar. Phase two will be in this area that is all traditional housing, all dormitory style housing. And ultimately, we will do this market and demand study and we will figure out what type of beds go in phase two. I suspect phase two will probably end up being a lot more apartment style, similar to Eastern Michigan for very similar reasons. But those are just two examples of how those schools looked at it. Again, all supported by a market and demand study.
And let's talk a bit about amenities. It's no secret that the preferences for amenities have shifted a bit after the pandemic. What amenities and design elements are essential today, and which amenities are becoming less important in student housing projects?
So when you say student housing, people always think of lazy rivers and resort style pools and that sort of thing. And then that is still very true in the off-campus world, but they are becoming less opulent and right sizing the amenities because they're expensive. And one of the number one things, whether you're on or off campus, is affordability. And things aren't getting any cheaper. So in the off campus, you're still seeing clubhouses, resort style pools, but they're becoming smaller and more appropriate, but well designed. And then interior spaces are becoming more focused on flexibility. So something that may be a yoga studio during the day can be converted to private study space at night. You're not building a separate gaming lounge and a TV lounge. You're building a multimedia lounge that can be both TV and gaming. Common spaces are becoming larger, but they're becoming more compartmentalized. So you may have a large common room, but the common room may have 3 or 4 different types of seating. May have open seating for studying and collaborating and playing a board game. And on the other side of the room, they'll have small study pods where a group of 1 to 4 students can go in, shut their door, plug in one laptop and do work on a common screen. So yeah, it kind of depends on the market, but I will tell you the spaces are becoming more flexible because we're trying not to duplicate spaces because square footage is expensive and that just decreases affordability. So it's almost becoming more focused on the design element, because if you have a room as big as the room is, and you could do very attractive, thoughtful placemaking design that's not very expensive. And so it's more focused on eliciting kind of an emotion from the student or making them comfortable in the space to do whatever it is that they want to do, whether they want to study or play a game or study with a group of people. But placemaking that space so it's attractive and inviting, but not overdoing it.
And I have one more question for you. Looking ahead, what do you think will define the next phase of student housing development, and where do you see the biggest opportunities for Gilbane?
So I think it's just going to be a continuation of kind of everything I said. I think it's going to be, I think it's not just going to be student housing. I think those that are in student housing are increasingly going to be called on to do more things. And we're kind of seeing that today. People who do student housing are finding ways to solve infrastructure problems. We're finding ways to solve parking challenges. We're finding ways to solve dining and moving classrooms into residential facilities. It's helping the schools solve their challenges in the most efficient way possible. So that, as I said before, the schools can accomplish more with less capital, whether that's P3 capital or their own capital. And I also think colleges and universities are embracing the private sector to be their master development partner. So maybe they want to finance it themselves. Maybe they do have the capacity to finance it on their balance sheet, but they realize, look, we may not be the best ones to design and develop this. We realize the private sector, the Gilbanes of the world are really good at designing and delivering these faster and better and more efficiently than we can. And it's not a knock on them. They just have a whole different set of rules if it's a state project that they have to follow. And sometimes that takes another year or two to do that. And that just delays the delivery of the project and cost them more money. So I think the private sector, the Gilbanes of the world, I think are able to offer a wider range of services to solve a greater number of challenges for schools, and we fully embrace that, being a builder, developer, financier, and operator of on-campus student facilities. And so where do we see that grow for us? You know, as I said before, we're very excited, and I think we're uniquely suited to continue to offer kind of a swath of services, given that we're vertically integrated, so that when we sit down and shake hands with a partner, they know that they're just shaking hands with Gilbane, and Gilbane's going to be their single partner to deliver on the whole design, build, operate, maintain, finance scope of the project.
I really like how you say Gilbanes of the world. That's sweet. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it. I think you had some very thoughtful questions, and I hope I gave you some good answers.
You surely did. Thank you very much for accepting to be my guest on the Student Housing Unlocked podcast. It was a very interesting discussion.
Well, terrific.
Thank you for listening to Student Housing Unlocked. Make sure to tune in for the next episode of our series in September. For more news, trend stories, and podcast episodes, visit multihousingnews.com. Moreover, don't hesitate to join MHN's Executive Council. Every month, we discuss the latest trends and topics with leading experts in the field, and your input could be extremely helpful. To join, please send an email to jessica.fiur@cpe-mhn.com. Looking forward to seeing you on our next episode.